I've heard it put forward by critical psychologists that that traditional scientific objectivity is like looking at a statue from one angle, whereas critical psychology, we acknowledge there's many angles. And I find that a bit patronizing to science, really. I don't think that amongst really mainstream established sciences like physics and biology and chemistry and so forth, that there is this kind of unity. They all have different approaches, but they are nevertheless quite comfortable with the idea that their approaches knit together.
Are they?
You know,
you sure?
I think so. Well, of course, there's disagreements, and that's where maybe science proceeds, where you find disagreements and you could hypothesize and move on. But for instance, you know, evolutionary biologists might want to tell a grand narrative about how particular traits of our species or any other species have emerged, and molecular biologists might want to look at the A, C, T, and G on the chromosomes. And I think, at least in principle, they're quite comfortable with the idea that those two sciences mesh. It sounds to me like you're saying that science shouldn't have to do that, or there might be forms of science that shouldn't mesh with established traditional physics, biology, and chemistry.
I don't think I'm saying that, because I think the thing is I'm not anti-science, I'm pro-science. I think that would be too easy. I mean, there is scientism, but then there are also problems with parodies of what people think of as postmodernism, which is not what mostly people think of it. It's not that anything goes and that any view is worthy. Things always have to be warranted in some way, and critical psychologists definitely understand that. But they would say, yes, but you do have to justify it. It isn't just because it's a natural science doesn't mean it's the best, because otherwise we're into a hierarchical game. What I'm talking about is more like a sort of brothers and sisters, where you have an idea where there are relationships between things, but it's also accepted that some places don't overlap. And there'd be places where there'd be core subject matter, like in physics or in psychology, which you'd say doesn't touch on anything else really, but there'd be other places where it touches on loads of things. And they're very important because that's the kind of cross-fertilization, that's where it takes place. But it wouldn't be just sciences, it would be. I mean, what about the arts and humanities? I don't hear about the humanities very much either. I mean, this is important because something like history easily gets left out of the debate unless it seems to have the very scientifically established kind of thing about artifacts. But I would say, well, what about archives? I mean, one of the reasons for having archives is because we also know that if we didn't keep them, there'd be no other way of keeping that knowledge in the world. It doesn't just exist because you could re-experiment. Actually, you have to carry it forward. Those books, that's why burning books is always considered to be one of the worst kind of crimes, really, because the whole point is we need those archives. We need to remember, we need to look again at these things. And so history and historians and their kind of work is hugely important. And again, most scientists would recognize this. I mean, the great scientists have always been the kind where you'd have Darwin taking a copy of Coleridge's poems on the Beagle. I mean, this is classically how people carry on. Their ideas come from all over the place. It's usually a bit strange that when somebody, probably not the person concerned, someone writing about them, addresses them as if they only sit within some very clearly defined area. And that's a very tabloid way of doing things, really. We want to tidy up the complexity, and we shouldn't. We should be joyful about the fact that there's such a complexity and engage with it, and then want other people to engage with us. So that, I mean, that's how it's done. I mean, that's what a community is in the end. It's a community of different views who share the passion for wanting to find out something. Yeah.
Would you ever say then that two people with like directly conflicting views that could be decided with an experiment should not do that experiment? I mean, I tend to think there's two ways of conflicting, really. There's speaking different languages, in which case a bit of translation and diplomacy ought to be able to sort out the fact that they're not really disagreeing, or and then there's disagreeing about matters of fact. I remember you saying once that you thought it would be a shame if psychoanalysis, fell on Popper's sword, and we just got rid of it. But there are matters of fact that psychoanalysis would disagree with, say, evolutionary psychology about. Freud would say that we have incestuous desires and it's culture that restrains them, whereas evolutionary psychology might say, oh no, there are good evolutionary reasons why we avoid incest. And in which case, I don't think those two things can just coexist peacefully. I think they've got to argue about it.
Why do we assume these things are on some kind of scale in the first place? And then perhaps assume, the worst crime that psychology commits is the idea that things are in opposition and then there's some kind of midpoint and then there's a bit of both and these kind of fudges which don't work. Because for a start off, they're not in conflict. I don't see social psychology and neuroscience to be in conflict. I just see them to be different. They're very different approaches to often similar phenomena, like the idea of what it is to be human, for example. Okay. So the question is kind of there, but then you're going to address it in very different ways. But I would have thought the neuroscientist is interested in what the social psychologist got to say, because if they only talk to members of their own community, they quickly run out of ideas. This is the whole point of it, really. But it doesn't mean you resolve it. But then I think your model of conflict is wrong. I don't think it is a conflict. It's not a competition. It's not like you can say this idea will win. So you'd be being selective. And I think that's the risk, is that what people do is they selectively argue with what they think they know and can condemn of other people. And what they need to do is perhaps be willing to engage more widely.
So taking the example of psychoanalysis and evolutionary psychology on incest, sure. If they're not at odds, then what are they? How do you proceed when there seems to be a disagreement?
Well, disagreement, because in that sense you can theorize about these things as in the sense of trying to find a story that fits what you know about something. But that's usually selective anyway. The evolutionary explanations usually are selective of those things that will fit with an evolutionary model. They'll carefully ignore. You see that argument. People pick on me with that as well. After all, I'm going to select those things that I can explain, and I'll leave other things out of the picture. And someone will come along and go, but Guy, you didn't explain the brain. And I'll go, well, because I'm not a brain scientist.
I'm not a neuroscientist. Yeah.
Why would I try to do that? At the same time, why would I expect a brain scientist or an evolutionary scientist to try and engage with a subject which is clearly off limits, really? It's at best, it's going to be a just-so story. It's probably going to be a distal explanation, not a proximal one, in which case you're going to be dealing with things where you'd say, I'm not sure where the real benefit of this is. Some areas should actually quietly go, we don't have an explanation for this. We suggest you knock next door.
Yeah. Okay. You've also claimed that that reductionism and atomizing the world into units is problematic. But going back to the Minchley quote about persons, are you having your cake and eating it there by saying that units are a bad thing, but persons are the unit to be thinking about?
I think the reason why we ended up talking about persons as units is because Minchley had to address this thing of, well, what's the correct unit? And the trouble is, for people outside the natural sciences, is the question from the natural sciences is, what's your unit? But that assumes everything is measured in that kind of way. I think you can play that game, but then you can't have it both ways. You can't go, tell us what your unit is, and then say, but you shouldn't be talking about units, should you? And you kind of go, well, hang on a minute. I'm now caught now in your fiendish plan, if you like. You've hooked me in, but you drew me on that. You asked me to talk in terms of units. I wouldn't talk in terms of units, no, because atomizing society, I don't think really helps. When we look at units anywhere, we kind of know they don't actually exist. There's no such thing as the gene as a unit. There's an idea of a gene, there's theories about genes and stuff and how they work. But if someone actually said, well, go on and show me a gene, you can't really do that. It's an idealized unit, because then it helps us talk about things. Well, I would say that's true of persons. The reason I talk about persons like that is because in an idealized way of talking, it'll help me talk about it. But if you want me to move away from that, I very easily talk to you about what would be interactions And then we'd have a huge problem talking about units because there are none.
Well, interactions and units are sort of two sides of the same coin, really, because you can't talk about two things interacting without bringing two things into existence theoretically.
But if you talk about the interaction itself, you see, the thing is there is no unitary basis. I mean, one of the things that was interesting enough to be brought up, and I wonder, I mean, I met him some years ago, Rom Harry, who was asked about this, and he put the conversation as the ideal unit. He said that should be the unit in psychology. That's what we should explore, examine, look at. Why? Because it typifies human behavior. I mean, what is human behavior? Well, the conversation, kind of the face-to-face, what we're doing now, it typifies what humans do, really. But if you ask the question, well, where's the conversation and can I measure it? I think you quickly realize this isn't going to work, because I mean, if I look at what's in your head, well, clearly that's, where you stand in relation to the conversation, but it would exclude me, and the same vice versa. If we took a recording of the whole thing, well, we still wouldn't have your standpoint or my standpoint. We'd be always leaving something out, because there would be more going on than you could unitize. It just doesn't fit a unitary idea of the world. But it is something we can analyze, because there are, and Midgley talks about this elsewhere, there are patterns in it. And it's the patterns all of a sudden that takes our interest, so we have a different way of coming at it, I suppose.
I quite agree with a lot of that. I certainly feel that...
We're not going to agree, are we?
Well, I certainly feel that when we unitize the world, we have to take responsibility for what we're doing, and we're not cleaving nature at its joints, but we might be striving towards the best way of describing nature, or at least an effective way of describing nature for our purposes. But I do think that dividing the world up is a necessary part of that process. I'm really fascinated by this analogy in Dawkins. I was glad you bring up genes, where he compares gene reductionism to having a recipe for a cake, right? Where the idea is that you would never say of a single word in the recipe of the cake, oh, that word explains the cake, because clearly you need the whole recipe and the whole set of interactions to explain the cake. But there is a sense, if you were to focus your attention on a particular word in the recipe, like tablespoon or something like that, that you could say that this word is responsible for a feature of the cake, like the cake's sweetness, for example. Like in context, tablespoon might mean a tablespoon of sugar, and if you change it to teaspoon, then you'd have a less sweet cake. So that's kind of how I understand reductionism and atomism, really. And I think, isn't that what neuroscience is doing? Aren't neuroscientists saying that brains in context have this effect, and brains in context, produce these phenomena?
But all analysis must do this. All analysis must do this. It must try and take something apart, and if you do that, well, you're going to atomize it in some way. So, I mean, it's not really surprising, and social psychologists will do this too. I mean, it's part of it. The problem is that, rather like what you said about cleaving nature at its joints, there are no joints. We kind of recognize that. So the analysis, it can be artificial and arbitrary. And I think a lot of that doesn't get recognized, because there would be other ways of cutting the cake, if you like, to use cake again. Yeah. Keep using the same metaphor. We would expect to be able to do that, such that, okay, we talk about genes, maybe talk about molecules, then we might talk about atoms and then subatomic particles. There'll be obviously lots of different ways of divvying this thing up.
Yeah.
That's fine once we do that. It's then when we think we can very easily stack them all back together again, and actually it's not quite like that.